There are things buried in old towns that no amount of concrete or time can keep down. In the northern hills of Vermont, tucked between rotting pine forests and forgotten rail lines, lies the quiet township of Drelham. You won't find much on it online, no local newspaper, no tourism board. It's the kind of place that seems to have always existed just slightly out of view. Population 1,237, according to a sign near the town's one-lane bridge. But everyone knows that number's wrong. No one changes that sign anymore. No one really knows how many people live or die there. Drelham's story is not the kind you find in history books. It's the kind people whisper about when they think no one is listening. And at the heart of that whisper lies a single family named Lenley, revered, feared, and, for more than 120 years, strangely unavoidable. The Lenleys were once considered the founders of Drelham's prosperity. They owned land, much of it, employing half the town in sawmills, orchards, and textile outbuildings as far back as 1892. But while other family dynasties faded, lost their money, or merged into larger names, the Lenleys stayed, quietly, consistently, and with them stayed a growing sense that something about them wasn't quite right. The last known matriarch of the Lenley family, Ms. Adelyn Lenley, was 89 years old when she walked into the Drelham police station on March 2, 2022, with a manila folder clutched in both hands. She said she wanted to speak to someone about things that were buried. The patrol officer on duty, Sergeant Nolan Reed, later described her as polite, poised, but with this uncanny calm, like someone returning library books, not confessing to the things she eventually did. What followed her statement would unearth more than just memories. It would uncover human remains, destroy long-standing institutions, and leave a wound in the town's psyche that no one quite knows how to close. The earliest records of the Lenleys date back to 1874, when a man named Abner Lenley purchased 40 acres of farmland just outside what would become Drelham's central square. According to the county's surveyor's logs, Abner was tall, gaunt fellow with hands too clean for someone who claimed to farm. He built the Lenley Estate by hand, a strange mix of Gothic and Federalist styles with steep eaves, iron-banded shutters, and a slate roof so black it made the house appear unlit even in daylight. Locals called it the Black House, and by 1900, the name had stuck. The estate remained closed off from the public. The family didn't attend church services, and the children, there were many, were taught at home. Even the servants, a rotating group of silent young women from out of town, never spoke much when they came into Drelham for supplies. They never stayed long. A series of uneventful decades followed, marked only by whispers and seasonal rumors. Children dared each other to trespass onto the Lenley land and returned pale and silent. One boy, 11-year-old Jesse Fowler, went missing in 1956 after claiming he'd seen figures in the woods, not people, not animals, something in between. His remains were never found. The official explanation was that he'd fallen into the nearby ravine, but his parents never believed it. Neither did the rest of town. Still, there was never any evidence. Nothing concrete to point toward the Lenleys. The family's wealth shielded them, and the town, reluctant to investigate its benefactors, turned a blind eye, until Adelyn spoke. Her voice, trembling at first, grew firmer as the interview progressed. The police transcripts, made public months later during the inquest, detail her confession in harrowing clarity. "My name is Adelyn Esther Lenley," she began. "I was born in the Black House in 1933, the seventh daughter of Dorian Lenley and Margaret Hale Lenley. I am the last surviving member of the primary line, and I believe I am responsible, if not legally, then spiritually, for what was done in those woods." The detective assigned to the case, Eleanor Dre, described the interview as something out of a fever dream. Adelyn went on to describe rituals, not metaphorical ones, actual gatherings held beneath the pine canopy, marked by iron markers embedded in the ground, long since rusted over. She called them the quiet sessions, and claimed they were carried out every equinox and solstice by her family and a small group of invited townsfolk. "They believed the land required binding," she said. "They believed there was something under it, older than us, something that had to be kept dormant, and the only way to do that was through offering. At first, the offers were symbolic effigies, pieces of livestock, but around 1911, according to her confession, that changed children, sometimes infants, always chosen carefully, always untraceable. The town's records held no direct corroboration, but following her confession, forensic teams began excavating the area she described, known locally as the Widow's Hollow. What they found made national news, briefly, before being hushed under legal proceedings. 3 shallow grave sites, bones dating from multiple decades. 2 of them confirmed through dental records and isotopic analysis to belong to children under the age of 10. One matched the age, location, and year of Jesse Fowler's disappearance. Another, unknown. Adelyn claimed not all the family agreed with the practice. Her sister Miriam attempted to flee in 1949 and was brought back by the groundskeeper. Her name appears on no death certificate. There is, however, a large stone slab in the family crypt with her initials etched faintly into the base. No date, no epitaph. Through all this, Adelyn spoke not with guilt, but with necessity. She said she came forward not to clear her conscience, but because they've started again. When asked to clarify, she said, "Not my family, the town." In the years following the death of the last patriarch, Ezra Lenley, in 1989, the estate had been left to rot. Most assumed the line had ended, but Adelyn had stayed in a small guest house behind the main property, receiving food and medicine from a local delivery service. No one had checked in on her in years. She was presumed senile alone. Yet inside that house were boxes of letters, journals, and charcoal drawings, some disturbingly detailed, that chronicled not just her own memories, but observations of what she believed to be continuing rituals, conducted not by her family but by others. "I saw children led into the woods, but not by us, by people I didn't recognize. Young ones, maybe new ones. It's changed, but it hasn't stopped." Detective Dre, in her official report, wrote, "This case has extended beyond the bounds of a familial crime. We are now investigating the possibility of a multi-generational belief system operating within Drelham, potentially involving persons of civic and educational authority." As more was uncovered, names began to surface. Teachers, clergy, even a former town councilwoman whose signature had appeared on forged adoption documents dating back to 1983. Every new name opened another door, and behind each one was a dark, unlit room full of evidence. More interviews, more confessions, and more bodies. But the true horror came not from the details themselves, but from how easily they had been hidden for how long and how many people had helped to keep it that way. A second team of forensic analysts arrived in Drelham on April 5, 2022. Under tight coordination with state authorities, the area surrounding the Lenley Estate and adjacent Widow's Hollow was sealed off with perimeter fencing and patrolled day and night. What began as a single site excavation quickly sprawled into something closer to an archaeological dig. One layered not in centuries but in secrets. At the center of it all, Adelyn Lenley remained housed in a temporary care facility at the edge of town. Monitored but not detained, her condition was deemed too fragile for holding. She would sit for interviews every other day, surrounded by microphones and a single lamp, carefully answering each question with the same strange clarity. Cold, formal, almost academic. One exchange, recorded on April 8, remains among the most disturbing. Why children, Adelyn, because they listen. Who to what? What's in the soil? You stop hearing it when you get older. But they don't. That's why they're chosen. Because it knows they can feel it. To outsiders, this would sound like senile delusion. But to those familiar with Drelham's history, it rang uncomfortably close to decades of missing persons reports, many of which had been quietly dropped or labeled as runaways. Even more unsettling were the journal entries from a now-deceased teacher, Margaret Fillin, discovered during a search of the old schoolhouse records. One entry, dated October 12, 1984, reads, "They came again today. Told me I'd been chosen to name the child. I said no, of course I did, but they already had the child blonde, 6 or 7, blue overalls, didn't cry, just looked at me like he already knew. I told them I wouldn't do it again. I wouldn't name him, but then I heard it again in the floor. That humming, I did it." The teacher had died in 1992, reportedly of carbon monoxide poisoning. Her obituary simply read, "Beloved by all." As state authorities dug deeper, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply from the Lenleys to Drelham itself. Patterns emerge. Donations to orphanages in neighboring counties, all tied back to a non-profit organization called the Green Path Foundation, registered to a P.O. box in Drelham. The charity had no online presence, no employees, and no recorded disbursements. But one local bank teller, speaking under anonymity, told investigators that envelopes with the Green Path stamp came through almost every month, always in cash, always thick. More chillingly, 5 of the adopted children funneled through Green Path between 1981 and 2002 had no high school graduation records, employment history, or proof of residence after the age of 13. None were ever reported missing. During this period, Detective Dre and her team issued subpoenas to over 30 Drelham residents, nearly 1 in every 40 adults in town. Publicly, the community responded with denial. A town hall meeting held on May 3 turned hostile, with angry residents shouting down investigators and accusing them of slander. One man, local grocer Peter Hartwell, said into the local news camera, "You people don't get it. This is a peaceful town. This is some crazy woman's story, and it's tearing us apart." But privately, things were shifting. 3 families sold their homes within days. A teacher resigned, and a quiet fear began to spread. There were no arrests yet, no indictments, but people knew. Among the unearthed materials from the Black House was a single VHS tape labeled Winter Solstice, 1990. Experts at the Bureau's Digital Forensics Division managed to restore parts of it. What they saw was never made public, but according to internal summaries leaked to the press months later, the tape showed series of hooded individuals surrounding what appears to be a stone altar in a clearing, while a child, blurred identity unknown, is placed on the slab and anointment rituals are performed. The full extent of the footage remains classified. Perhaps more disturbing than what was found was what was missing. For every piece of evidence that pointed toward the presence of a secret society or cult within Drelham, there were corresponding gaps. Erased public records, shredded archives, destroyed medical files. Someone had not only been hiding something, they had been actively removing traces of it for decades. Adelyn Lenley continued to speak. Her accounts grew more fragmented, sometimes drifting into unsettling territory that investigators labeled narrative dissociation. She spoke of the ones beneath, of roots that moved, of faces in the water near the orchard. Most of it was disregarded, but not all. In one recorded session, she mentioned an underground room beneath the Black House, accessed only during nights of binding. She called it the vault. Teams returned to the Black House with ground-penetrating radar. On May 17th, they uncovered a sealed limestone hatch beneath the north cellar. Inside were shelves, old, decaying, but still standing. Along them bundles wrapped in waxcloth, 27 in total. Each bundle contained children's clothing, all of it untouched by decay, as if protected by some unnatural condition. No bodies, no bones, just the clothes, and something else. On the far wall, carved into the stone in a hand-etched scrawl, were dozens of names, some known, many not, etched beneath the Latin phrase, huius nutuae terram, blood nourishes the earth. A forensic linguist from Dartmouth University was brought in to assess the context. Her findings were grim. The phrase had historical precedence in 13th century agrarian cults across southern Europe, sects that believed soil required not only water and sun but human vitality in order to yield crops of eternal yield. Most were wiped out during the Black Death, or so it was thought. The parallels were enough to draw federal attention. On June 3, 2022, the FBI opened a formal investigation into the Drelham rituals. Dozens of agents descended on the town, prompting a state of emergency. Locals were warned not to leave the area. Search warrants were executed at 6 properties linked to the original Green Path Board members. 3 of them had disappeared. One, a retired pastor named Kenneth Larch, was found dead in his home. But what investigators found in his basement would become the single most damning piece of evidence to date. A handwritten ledger nearly 200 pages long listing names, dates and locations of ceremonies held between 1975 and 2011, each entry marked with a strange symbol, a twisted, root-like spiral, and a designation Y, or X. The meaning of those letters has never been officially disclosed, but Adelyn, when shown a copy of the ledger, only said, the Y ones survived, the X ones didn't. By mid-June, public pressure on state officials to close the investigation mounted. But the weight of evidence had grown undeniable. Arrests began. 8 individuals were formally charged with conspiracy to commit ritualistic abuse, unlawful adoption, and obstruction of justice. All of them held long-standing positions in Drelham's infrastructure: a deputy mayor, a retired doctor, 2 school administrators, and a mortician among them. Their arraignment was held behind closed doors, citing public safety. And yet, not one of them confessed. When asked about the charges, one woman, a 74-year-old retired social worker named Eloise Marin, simply smiled and said, "You don't unplant the seed once it's in the ground." The case was far from over, but the soil of Drelham had begun to speak. As summer came to Drelham, the town grew quiet. Not the stillness of peace, but of anticipation, of dread. Streets emptied earlier in the day. Porch lights stayed on all night. Stores that had once stayed open until 9 now closed by 5. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would surface next from the shadows they had long tried to forget. Inside the Drelham County Courthouse, sealed testimonies were taken from dozens of witnesses. Many were elderly. Some were children at the time of the events in question, now adults with fragmented memories. What emerged from their accounts was not a story of a few rogue individuals committing isolated atrocities, but a culture of generational silence, reinforced by fear, ritual, and something else. Something harder to explain. One witness, Maria Ellsworth, age 62, described her memories from 1974 as like dreams, but with smell. She recalled being taken to a ceremony in the Hollow, where she stood beside other children and was made to repeat words in a language she didn't understand. "I remember there was a man with no shoes. His feet were bleeding. But he smiled. He kept smiling even when they pushed him onto the stones. They said he had to walk the root path, that it would feed the earth. I just watched. We all did. No one screamed. We were taught not to scream." When asked why she hadn't spoken up earlier, Maria said, "You don't break from the root. You get pulled out, you don't come back. I saw what happened to Lisa Turrell. She talked, and then she drowned. They said it was an accident. I saw the bruises. I saw the pine needles in her mouth." Lisa Turrell's death was indeed ruled accidental in 1981, a fall into Quarry Pond during winter. But her name now appeared in 3 separate witness accounts, all associating her with pre-ritual conditioning sessions, reportedly held in the basement of the old Drelham Library. A building no longer in use, its entrance now sealed by a rusting iron gate. The library's basement was searched on July 10th. No evidence was found. But the town's blueprints confirmed a sealed-off sub-basement, filled in with concrete in 1995 during structural renovations. That same year, Drelham saw its largest single-year spike in disappearances. 7 children, none ever found. And then there were the documents. On July 13th, a legal team associated with the state unearthed a series of private correspondences from the early 20th century, preserved in a family-safe deposit box belonging to the Weltrich family, distant cousins of the Lenleys by marriage. The letters, written between 1910 and 1927, detailed instructions for gatherings, naming ceremonies, and something referred to only as the turning. In one letter dated March 3, 1921, the writer says, "We must ensure the host does not forget its function. The binding is weakened by memory. That is why the chosen must not know. They must walk into it willingly, as all offerings should. If they scream, the soil rejects them." Another letter ended simply with, "We are stewards, not masters. The earth has never belonged to us." That phrase, "the earth has never belonged to us," would become the subject of national speculation, appearing in online forums, podcasts, and horror blogs. Many theorized that the Drelham rituals were based on some kind of old-world paganism, possibly imported through early European settlers and cloaked in a rural American mythos. But others weren't so sure. By the end of July, 2 more graves were discovered outside the boundaries of Widow's Hollow, one beneath the collapsed remains of a root cellar, and another near the old train line. Both sites showed signs of ceremonial burial, concentric ring patterns drawn in ash, along with iron symbols pressed into the surrounding soil. And the bones, these weren't children. Both skeletons were adult-sized. One bore signs of blunt trauma to the back of the skull, the other had arms bound behind with copper wire. Cause of death in both cases undetermined. Estimated dates 1940s and early 2000s. It became increasingly clear that the offerings may not have always been children, and that not all of them had gone willingly. The community remained fractured. Some residents packed up and left. Others barricaded themselves in. Most simply tried to act as though life continued. But the fear had changed shape. People no longer feared the Lenleys. They feared what might happen now that the Lenleys were gone. Adelyn's health deteriorated rapidly in early August. On August 11th, she suffered a mild stroke and was moved to a long-term care facility under state watch. Her final interview, conducted just 4 days prior, was brief and almost completely lucid. "Entuarvamu, do you believe the rituals are still happening? We lie in? Yes, Entuarvamu. But who? Adelyn, not people. Not anymore. Entuarvawar, what do you mean?" She looked up, then slowly pointed toward the ground beneath her feet. "We taught it to need us. Now it knows how to feed itself." The recording ends shortly after, as her hands began to tremble and she fell into silence. She died on September 2nd. No next of kin, no burial requested. She was cremated per her will. The town of Drelham, meanwhile, passed a moratorium on new construction permits around the area of the Black House and Widow's Hollow. The official explanation: geological instability. But locals knew the truth. They had seen what lay underneath. A final investigation report, compiled by the Bureau and released under heavy redaction in October 2022, listed over 80 incidents of concern and acknowledged the probable existence of a non-governmental, intergenerational belief structure involving ritualistic practices, coercive adoption procedures, and possible human sacrifice, likely concealed through systemic manipulation of legal and civic channels. The report stopped short of naming it a cult. But those who lived in Drelham, those who remained, didn't need it spelled out. By winter, the Lenley Estate was declared a historic hazard zone. Fencing was reinforced, surveillance installed. Trespassers would be prosecuted. But late one night, December 23rd, a local security camera recorded footage of a small group of figures walking quietly toward Widow's Hollow. 3 adults, 2 children, flashlights off, their forms barely visible in the snow. No one saw them return. The file was turned over to state police. Nothing was said publicly. Drelham's population now stands at 119. No one changes the sign. In the months that followed, silence once again settled over Drelham, but not the kind anyone welcomed. It was the silence of frayed nerves, of things too large to understand and too painful to speak aloud. Conversations in town grew clipped. Eyelids flicked shut when names were mentioned. The courthouse lights, once burning late into the evening during the height of the investigation, now shut off before dusk. No new arrests were made after December. But that didn't mean the case was over. Behind the scenes, forensic psychologists, archivists, and legal historians began to piece together a broader narrative, one that would reshape how such events were studied in the future. In January 2023, a sealed federal report was submitted to the Department of Justice. Though the full content remains classified, a partially leaked summary, published by a whistleblower journalist, contained 5 words that quickly went viral across dark corners of the internet. The town participated, entirely, knowingly. The implications were staggering. It meant Drelham was not the site of a crime. It was the crime. The secrecy had not been enforced by fear alone. It had been normalized, woven into the civic fabric, passed down like heirlooms. And it had lasted over a century. Like a living parasite that no longer needed a host, it had learned to wear the town itself like a mask. A new investigative unit was formed, headed by Dr. Elise Vorner, a cultural anthropologist who had previously studied isolated rural sects in Eastern Europe. In her preliminary briefings to federal agencies, she described the Lenley phenomenon not as a religious cult, nor a traditional criminal syndicate, but as an autonomous folk system of sacrificial order, maintained through social cohesion, strategic amnesia, and a deeply localized cosmology. She wrote, "What emerged in Drelham was not the continuation of old evil, it was the birth of something new. A belief system that, once fed with silence, bred its own logic, its own language, and its own necessity. The Lenleys may have founded it, but the town grew it, and once it took root it was no longer theirs to control." By April 2023, civil lawsuits began piling up. Families of missing persons, former foster children, even townspeople who claimed psychological trauma from being raised under what they described as ritual pressure. Many of the cases remain unresolved. Most were settled quietly, without public records. The state's response was slow, methodical, and conflicted. For every attempt to offer justice, there was resistance from those who still, somehow, clung to the old narratives. There are still those in Drelham who believe the rituals were necessary. One anonymous former councilman, recorded during a confidential legal deposition, said, "It kept us safe. You don't understand what this town went through before the practices. The soil went sour. Children were born sick. The river dried up. Afterward, crops came in. People lived longer. We didn't do it because we were evil. We did it because we were desperate." That deposition was sealed by court order, but its contents live on, shared in hushed conversation in cryptic online forums, and, reportedly, in a series of pamphlets distributed anonymously around New England churches. Pamphlets bearing the mark found in the Black House vault, the root, like spiral. No arrests have been made since 2023. No further graves have been discovered. The official position is that the investigation remains open and active, but no one in Drelham talks to reporters anymore. The few outsiders who have visited in recent months describe the town as eerily quiet, with residents who appear friendly on the surface, but become withdrawn if questioned too directly. Some report being followed on their way out. Others, more fringe voices, claim they heard something, a hum beneath the ground, a vibration in the floorboards of the old mill, like a deep chord buried beneath the earth. The Lenley Estate still stands, boarded, bolted, and surrounded by steel fencing. It leans slightly to the left now, its slate roof curling like dried skin, its windows blind, but it has not been demolished. A clause in Adelyn Lenley's will, tied to obscure land trust agreements, prohibits it. The house remains until it is unneeded. The document reads, "Unneeded for what remains unclear." Today, Drelham exists in a kind of legal and psychological purgatory, too notorious to ignore, too legally fragmented to prosecute at scale. Most media attention has faded. Only fringe documentaries and niche horror channels still try to piece together what happened and what it meant. But those who live there know. They know about the nights when the soil was wet, even when it hadn't rained. They know about the missing dogs, the locked school basements, the whispers from the trees. They know about the children who never screamed. And some still believe the soil is watching. In her final written statement, found in a locked drawer beneath her hospice bed, Adelyn Lenley left one last message, handwritten, neat, dated 3 days before her death. "I was the last matriarch. I ended the line, but I didn't end the need. We were only ever a mouthpiece. What lives below speaks through many voices, and silence, too, is a voice." The Black House still casts a shadow at sunset that stretches all the way to the edge of Widow's Hollow. No birds sing there. Not anymore. This has been another story from the Ghastly Journal. If you have information about a case like this, or if you've lived somewhere that still whispers at night, you know where to find us. Until next time, sleep lightly,